Unleash the power of knowledge and connect with the heartbeat of the African diaspora. Download our African Diaspora News Channel app now on Google Play and Apple App Store. Stay informed with authentic and diverse perspectives, breaking news, and cultural insights. Immerse yourself in a community that celebrates unity, resilience, and progress. Experience the vibrancy of the diaspora at your fingertips. Don't miss out. Empower your perspective today. Search African Diaspora News Channel and join the conversation.
What is wrong with DRC, you might ask? Why have they been fighting for over 30 years? Why are we continuing to see bloodshed of women, children losing their parents, losing their future? Why are we continuing to see a civil war that has spanned decades, that has gone from one generation to another? Why is it that the richest country on the African continent by resources, a country that has over $24 trillion worth of resources underground, that has gold, that has diamond, that has cobalt, that has lithium, that has copper, why do we continue to see fighting in this country? And what will it take to restore peace? But at what price? You know what the problem is? According to Professor Jeffrey Search, who was one of my teachers at Columbia, the problem is the United States of America and its Western allies, who do not want peace and stability in DRC for their own selfish interests.
It's interesting, we heard from the minister of DRC. What's wrong with your country? Well, we don't even start by saying the King of Belgium created a slave colony for 30 years. The government of Belgium ran the slave colony for another 40 years. The CIA assassinated your first popular leader, Mr. Lumumba, and then installed another dictatorship for the next 30 years. And then Glencore and others now suck out your cobalt without giving you tax income. We don't reflect on that. We say, what's wrong with you? Why don't you govern properly?
Hello there, how are you doing? Welcome to another episode of our conversations. My name is Adira Ganga. I am a business journalist by profession and a digital content creator. I love coming on here and having conversations with you guys about Black people, Africans, our empowerment, and how we can rise up and take our rightful place at the global stage. You can connect with me on social media at Adira Ganga, or you can come over to my YouTube channel. The name is New Dawn Africa channel, where I profile Africa through people, politics, and culture. A while back I did a video on DRC, but it was from the point of view of somebody who is of Democratic Republic of Congo background. They are a native of the land. Even though they didn't live in Congo, it was still heartbreaking to see what is happening in their country. And you know, we just finished playing Africa Cup of Nations. DRC did really well. They went all the way to the semifinals and they only lost to South Africa during penalty shootouts. But what stood out for me during this period was the fact that every time they went out to the pitch and the national anthem was being sung, they took this opportunity to protest against the genocide that is going on in the DRC Congo. We all act as if nothing is happening in DRC. You know, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we were all up in arms. Everybody was talking about how horrific it is. And it wasn't even the moment it began happening, everybody was covering it. Everybody was talking about it. Now, Israel and Hamas, when Hamas first invaded Israel and did the heinous deeds that they did, that was what was being covered. World leaders convert, people were making decisions. And now when Israel is using brute force to retaliate over what Hamas did to the people, the whole world, everybody has a Palestinian flag on their Twitter handle talking about Free Palestine. And two things can coexist. I'm not saying that it's not right to speak about the freedom of Ukraine, to speak about the freedom of Palestine, but these things are also happening on the African continent. Yeah, there has been a war in DRC for 30 years. Let that sink in for a minute. The visuals that you see from Palestine, from Ukraine, that has been less than 5 years. Israel is not even a year yet. Ukraine it has been 30 years. Let us just break down some of this concept. Children grow up without parents in the DRC because of that war. Parents are becoming maimed because of that war. Women are being abused. Men are being forced. Children are being forced to become, young boys are being forced to become men at a really tender age of 14 and 15 to fight. Children are working in mines because of the instability. They have to put bread on the table. People are being forced to leave their homeland to go to Canada, the US, France, and be second-class citizens because there's a war in their home. Over what? Their God-given resources. Who is behind this war? I'll tell you this. I'm Kenyan. And during 2007, 2008, we had post-election violence. And this is how I know that violence is not ingrained in the DNA of Africans. It's something that we are taught, or it's something that has proxies. When there were clashes in Kenya, it didn't even last a month. You know, blood has so much significance on the African continent that 2 weeks, 3 weeks of bloodshed, if there aren't external forces, people always come to their senses. Africans are very big on conversations, conflict mediation. And after what happened in Kenya, 2007, 2008, most of the time people always say, oh, Kenyan elections are very heated. We don't know what will happen. And I always tell them, as a Kenyan, I can tell you what will happen. We will push that envelope as far as we can. But those scenes that happened in 2007 and 2008, where people were butchering each other, that will never happen again. Because we understand the consequences of war, we value human life, and also funding a war internally is very, very expensive. I'll give you again an example with Kenya. There was no bread. The maize flour doubled in price. The value of the dollar skyrocketed in a period of 3 weeks. It's almost like the country crumbled in 3 weeks. And it got to a point where we had to have a conversation as a country. So please tell me why there has been a consistent war in DRC for 30 years. What are the fundamental questions here? What is being fought over? The mineral resources. Those mineral resources do not belong to one particular person. Again, I'll give you an analogy. This is something that my dad taught me that is just part of, I'm a River Lake Nilote, I'm a Luo, so this is part of our Luo tradition. And there was a time somebody wanted my dad to sell land to them, and my dad refused, and they kept coming back and they kept coming back, and they wanted to do massive developments on that land, and my dad kept refusing despite the amount of money that they were quoting. And one day I just asked him, you know, you'd be bawling if you take this deal. And he said, ancestral land, particularly where your people, you know, there has been history of your ancestors being buried there, you don't sell it. That land doesn't belong to you, you're just a guardian of that land. So let us apply that analogy even to DRC and their resources. Those resources belong to the country of DRC, not even necessarily the people are the guardians of their country's resources. Theirs is to protect it, benefit from it, preserve it for the next generation. And if they use it, they need to use it in a way that benefits the generation that comes after them. So at this point, no one person can claim ownership. And the problem with capitalism is it has introduced that kind of ownership over resources that are supposed to be benefiting the whole country and generation after generation. That is where corruption comes in. That's where Western influence comes in. And that's how the conflict comes in, because greed seeps in. That is one. Two, how are they able to fund and facilitate a war for 30 years of fighting? Children have been born into war and they're giving birth to children into war. I don't think that the human body and the human mind and the human spirit was built to take that kind of chaos. So who is actually funding this war, right? Does DRC have a drone manufacturing facility? Do they produce their own guns? Do they produce their own bullets? Are they producing the weapons that they use? So where are these weapons coming from? And who is benefiting from selling these weapons to DRC? If DRC stops buying the weapons, or if the war ends, who's going to lose out? How are they paying for these weapons? This is a country that has been in fighting mode for such a long time, and it's just most recently, in just under 10 years, where things have begun turning, when the EV industry began picking up, and proceeds from copper and cobalt were what were used to be invested in education and healthcare. It's a very recent development. So how are they paying for these weapons? Somebody once said that Western development is powered by African natural resources, was back during colonization. And they don't recognize that we don't live in those times anymore. They're still trying to use those crude methods to continue powering their development ambitions, but at what cost? At what cost? I studied history when I was in school, and the history of colonization on the African continent is brutal. It's brutal. Maybe some of you who watch the content of the channel from the West, the history is not as robust, particularly African history. I know like many Black Americans learn about the history of Black people in America, how they came to America, and what has happened to them in the last 400 years and continues to happen to them until to date. But as here on the continent, we learn our own history of what white people came here and did. The atrocities that they committed here, all for what? In the name of free labor and resources. And they continue to perpetuate that cycle. If they're not doing it like France, La France Afrique through business deals, they're doing it by sponsoring chaos in DRC. And then we sit back, and it's not even Africans who ask these questions because we're very sympathetic towards DRC. It's just there's very little, also our leaders are toothless bulldogs. And so there's very little that we can do to help our neighbors. But then Western countries will sit and point a finger of blame at Africans and say, oh, look at these people. What is wrong with DRC? Why can't you get your act together? Of course, DRC would have loved to get its act together. But do you know the harrowing history of DRC in the hands of Belgium and King Leopold? These are the things that break my heart so much, but then it warms my heart because Africans and the world over is beginning to open their eyes and realize that what is happening to DRC has so many layers, you know. Of course, it's the people of DRC that pick the guns to fight, but where's the gun from? Who puts the bullet in the gun? Who calls the shots? Before white men ever set foot on the African continent, of course, there were wars that we learned in history, but these were wars to steal each other's cattle, wars to steal each other's, or wars that were triggered by something. But conversation was always at the center of it. It defeats logic that there has been a war in a very rich country for 30 years. Tell me in the comment section if it makes sense, but let's listen to what Professor Jeffrey Sachs had to say about this.
It's interesting. We heard from the minister of DRC. What's wrong with your country? Well, we don't even start by saying the King of Belgium created a slave colony for 30 years. The government of Belgium ran the slave colony for another 40 years. The CIA assassinated your first popular leader, Mr. Lumumba, and then installed another dictatorship for the next 30 years. And then Glencore and others now suck out your cobalt without giving you tax income. We don't reflect on that. We say, what's wrong with you? Why don't you govern properly? And so we have a system, but we need a different system. We cannot turn this over to the private sector. We already did about 100 years ago. Not only to the private sector with the U.S. military behind it, with the defense of these property rights in the minister of Honduras's country, where United Fruit ran the country for a long time. And their attorney was the foreign minister of the United States, Secretary Dulles, and his brother was the head of the CIA and overthrew the next-door neighbor, Mr. Arbenz, to make sure that United Fruit could have its property. So we have a system, but we need a different system.
Thank you so much for watching the video. Let me know what you think about this video in the comment section. If you're from DRC, kindly let us know what the situation is and what you make from an inside-out perspective of why there's been conflict in your home. And in solidarity, when you're dropping down your comment, just drop the DRC flag so the people know that we're thinking about them. And we'll keep talking about what's going on in their home country until one day they are free. While we chant Free Palestine, we should also add Free DRC in there. Thank you so much for watching.